Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir. Then again I'm falling. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. I'm rising, yes sir. Then again I'm falling. Let Jesus work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out.
die before I wait. I pray to the Lord, my soul to take.
All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos, and today I want to talk to you guys about high culture, drugs, mysticism, and the modern world. And so the basis for today's stream actually has to do with an academic research paper I'm currently writing. And so I'm working on this very deep and complex paper talking about drugs as quote-unquote technologies of transcendence. And so I'm going to get into what my paper is about, but today's stream, once we actually get into, once I discuss my paper, what it is that I'm working on here. When I'm not streaming, guys, I'm actually surrounded by tons of books. You guys have no idea, but here's some of the books just I was using yesterday. Here's some of the other ones I'm using. And so we're going to talk a little bit about these books, a little bit about my research, but I'm going to read to you guys the concluding chapters, commentary on this book right here. What's this book called? Well, you may have figured it out with the title of today's stream. It's actually High Culture: Drugs, Mysticism, and the Pursuit of Transcendence in the Modern World by scholar Christopher Partridge. And so Christopher Partridge is a religious studies philosophy scholar over in the UK. And I have a few of his books. Another one right here is The Reenchantment of the West. And he does really good work. Now, is he going to be supportive of some of the perspectives, the moral and theological presuppositions on this channel? No, not exactly. But the way that he writes his scholastic work, it is so deep, it is so well read, it is so sophisticated that I'm using it. It's a basis for my research, but I wanted to share with you this book called High Culture and actually read each chapter's concluding comments so you can get a basis of what this book is actually about. And if you would like to pursue it or read it in the future, then you'd be able to. And so one of the theoretical concepts that he's using in his work that I'm building upon is this idea of technologies, or techne. Now, he refers to these technologies of transcendence, which I'm actually agreeing with. And I want to build and go further in his theory, which is in actually both these books, than what he develops. And so if you look into the Greek etymology, the Greek definition for the word techne. Techne is the root word for technique or technology, right? So technology is actually the study of techniques. And techne, the basic word for a technique, is actually in the Greek. The techne is a way, manner, or means whereby a thing is gained. A way, manner, or means whereby a thing is gained. And so I'm working on this paper called Tracing Technologies of Transcendence, the Spiritual Use of Psychoactive Drugs, and talking about how the use of inebriating substances, drugs, be them psychedelics, be it opium, hashish, mostly either psychedelic mushrooms, ayahuasca, or peyote, opium, hashish, these types of things, as technologies. And so I get this concept from scholar Christopher Partridge and him talking about how they are techniques, and this is, if you look at the root word, a way, manner, or means whereby a thing is gained, and that this is a sort of materialistic spirituality, that when you look at the history of drug-induced mysticism, going back to archaic forms of shamanism, going back to the ancient mystery cults, whether it be the Mithraic mysteries of Persia and Rome, whether it be the Greek mystery over in Eleusis, whether it be in many of the mystery cults of the ancient world that promoted the use of psychedelics, there's a sort of materialistic spirituality. And this is something that scholar Walter Hanegraaff, so in this book, Contemporary Esotericism, because for those of you who don't know, my scholarship actually resides in the world of religious studies, new religious movements, and Western esoteric traditions. And so a very important scholar, Walter Hanegraaff, as you see right there, wrote this very important article called Entheogenic Esotericism. And this is part of my theory. And tracing the use of these technologies, these techniques for drug-induced mysticism, all the way from the shamanic, the prehistorical, through the archaic, through antiquity, into modernity. And so this is something that brought up a whole thing in my mind is how the inability for so many people to actually have a historical timeline. When somebody says early antiquity, late antiquity, early modernity, later modernity, what do those things mean to you? And if you're not able to actually have a strong historical timeline in one's mind, history becomes really discombobulating. It's difficult to kind of see the historical trends and threads throughout world religions, throughout the intellectual history, throughout all these different things. And so my argument is that using this Greek word techne, that technologies are means by which we deliberately gain something, that the thing to be gained is a sort of mystical experience, mysticism itself. And from the ancient period into the modernity, through the modern period, of which we've talked about, the Italian Renaissance, Marsilio Ficino, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, the Moorish occupation of Spain. How many of you guys are aware that the Muslims actually ruled Spain from, generally speaking, the 700s to the 1300s? This is really important because it's actually in the Iberian Peninsula where Sufism and Kabbalah and Christian mysticism get mingled and develop this new concept in history called perennialism, or as they called it, the Prisca Theologia, or the Philosophia Perennis, the perennial philosophy. And this eventually gets picked up, as we'll see, with the perennial philosophy of Aldous Huxley in the 20th century, his books, The Doors of Perception, in the 20th century. And that's what I'm going to get at with this book. So tracing the use of drugs, we can see shamanic prehistory, tribal organization, mystery traditions, and antiquity. And then for Western Europe mostly, or for European Christian culture, there's sort of a break. And this break is Christianity. And so within the development of Christianity, especially the conversion of the Roman Empire and the movement of the capital over to Constantinople, the erection of the Byzantine Empire, many of these ancient mystery traditions and stuff get squashed. So it isn't until they get reintroduced, really, I would argue, with the Moorish occupation in Spain, because I guarantee that the Sufic mystics who are known to partake in hashish use were actually using and showing, probably sharing some of this stuff over in the Iberian Peninsula. And so these techniques for mystical achievement we can find throughout the mystery traditions, of which, when I showed you in a previous stream, looking at the scholastic, the academic constructions of mysticism and how you study mysticism, that the Greek word mustos actually has to do with an initiate, that the mysterion is a secret. And so the whole reason why we call these ancient mystery traditions is because mysticism was usually always about a sort of initiation process, which goes very nicely with my use of psychedelics and the use of drug-induced mysticism as its own sort of initiation in one way or another. But what's interesting, and something that I've highlighted in my paper, is how the break between Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity. So some of the books, for example, that I'm writing about, I got tons of different stuff, but some of you guys may have seen a more popular book that's going around right now called The Immortality Key. And this is an argument talking about basically trying to connect the Eleusinian mysteries with the Kikekion. The Kikekion is an inebriating drink, which is believed to be the central basis of the Eleusinian mysteries, who, in this book right here, they argue is an ergotized alkaloid, very a similar precursor to that of LSD. And so he's arguing in the Immortality Key that these ancient mystery traditions are actually continued in Christianity. And so how we would understand the Eucharist in Christianity as potentially bringing us towards spiritual immortality, bringing us one with deity, is actually a sort of sober misunderstanding of a psychedelic tradition. Now, one of the things that I've highlighted in my paper, in my research regarding this, is how, interestingly, there's a very famous work by R. Gordon Wassen, and he was a high-ranking official over at J.P. Morgan, but he was kind of an amateur mycologist and really got a lot of the scholarship off the ground regarding looking at psychedelic mushrooms around the world. And him and his Russian wife, Valentina Pavlovna, they wrote this really important book called Mushrooms, Russia, and History. Now, this book is incredibly expensive. There are only 512 books that were printed, and I think if you go on the Amazon, it's like $7,000 just for one of the hard copies. So very, very expensive book. But I have a digital copy, and in it, it talks about the linguistic relationship that, and I mentioned this in previous streams, that within Slavic culture, Slavic language, there's tons of different words for mushrooms, and that their cultures relate to mushrooms in a very different way. So in English, we are kind of mushroom deprived. We have fungus, we have mushroom, and we have toadstool. We have 3 words to refer to mushrooms, and all 3 of those relate to the general category of mushrooms, where when you look into the Russian language, you see a multiplicity of words, hundreds of words, talking and describing mushrooms, and each word having a specific description of a specific type of mushroom. In their book, so they talk about how Slavic languages, Slavic cultures have a totally different relationship to mushrooms. And young girls, it's very common for them to go out into the woods and pick mushrooms with their mother or their grandmother or their grandparents. In the West, we don't have this. Yet at the same time, all these books, whether it be the Immortality Key, whether it be the Psychedelic Gospels, whether it be all the works from Carl A.P. Ruck, what's very interesting is all the works that try to tie Christianity into the old tradition of these drugs, or the Eucharist being a sort of remnant of a psychedelic drug. It always ties to Catholicism. I noticed that in almost invariably all the research that I found describing Christianity as a remnant of these psychedelic traditions, it's always Western Catholicism. And so I'm making the argument that it actually is Western Catholicism because, one, the Catholicism, if you've read this book, for example, God, History, and Dialectic by Joseph P. Farrell, The Theological Foundations of the Two Europes and Their Cultural Consequences, one of the arguments that he makes quite clear is that the Latin West is the continuation of the Greco-Roman Empire, the Greco-Roman styles of culture, the Greco-Roman styles of art. This is why you see statuary, you see natural philosophy, natural theology get going here. You see many of the presuppositions of the Greco-Roman period, even the veneration of Hermes and some of the, the cathedral in Siena, I forget. Based on Joseph P. Farrell's argument that the West, the Latin West, not the Greek East, is actually more in line and consistent with the Greco-Roman Empire, where, again, these mystery traditions were replete. And so if hashish use, for example, gets brought back into Europe or becomes more popularized through the perennialistic schools in the Iberian Peninsula, it makes sense why then these drugs get brought into Western esoteric traditions, the Western esotericism. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Western esoteric traditions. This is the history of alchemy. This is the history of Western magic. This is the basis for Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, the secret societies, the Hermetic Golden Dawn, Theosophy. All this different stuff is put into a box called Western Esoteric Traditions. And it's in these Western Esoteric Traditions that the continuation of these techniques, these technologies of transcendence get going. And we can point even to somebody like Paracelsus. Paracelsus is a very important alchemist, German alchemist. I did a whole stream talking about Paracelsus and how Paracelsus is known for his use of opium. And he's one of the first Western scholars to actually document opium and its side effects. And he's considered, look on any sort of medical site, to be the founder of laudanum. Laudanum is the mixture of opium, gum opium, with alcohol. This is something that you can drink. And he used this as a sort of medicinal practice. But obviously, if you take enough laudanum, you can get into sort of mystical states. And so we see Aleister Crowley get into opium. We see Helena Blavatsky get into opium. We see both those, Aleister Crowley and Helena Blavatsky both get into hashish use. And so these techniques, you continue to trace these from the prehistory, the shamanic, the tribal, and to the ancient mysteries, be it the Rig Veda and its description of Soma. Who is this god Soma from the Rig Veda? Who, again, you take in, you become inebriated by, and then you're revealed mysteries, you're revealed secret truths. whether it be the Rig Veda, whether it be Pagamon Harmala used in the Zoroastrian traditions, the Zoroastrian mysteries, Mithraic mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries, and there's tons, the Dionysian mysteries. There's all these different things in the ancient world. And then there's a break with Christianity, but they continue. You can see hashish use, for example, in Islam, and then it gets brought into the Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, where Kabbalah, Christian mysticism, and Sufism get going to really come up with these new concepts of perennialism. All traditions are kind of built upon a sort of archaic structure of religious truth. And from there, you see the Italian Renaissance in the 1450s, in the 15th century with Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Piccadillo Mirandola, where they put forth this Prisca Theologia, this perennial philosophy. And then that breaks into, you have the Protestant Reformation, 1517, and as the Protestant Reformation occurs, Protestantism begins to stamp out many of the mystical elements of Christianity, and in so doing, you see the rise of alchemy, you see the rise of magic, ritual magic, John Dee in the 16th century. John Dee in the 16th century is often considered one of the most magical centuries in European history. Well, ironically, it's the same century that we have the Protestant Reformation. And in these magical traditions, the use or the technique, the technologies of transcendence are perpetuated. And so you look through the Western esoteric traditions, you can see all this stuff, and then you look at Aleister Crowley, Helena Blavatsky, and then that moves into the 20th century from the 19th century, and there we see Aldous Huxley, and then the synthesis of LSD by Dr. Albert Hofmann in the 1930s leads to the 1940s and 50s being times in which they're experimenting and exploring the potential use of LSD. And then you have the Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. You have the perennial philosophy from Aldous Huxley, and you can see all these things kind of coalescing together. Perennialism, magic, and the techniques of transcendence, the use of drugs. And you move that, and then you see how Timothy Leary of the counterculture, the 1960s counterculture, where psychedelics really come from a sort of esoteric place, especially within the Western esoteric magical traditions, and it's brought forth into the forefront. It's brought forth into the public. And from there, now the counterculture has brought psychedelics into the sort of try to normalize them as technologies of transcendence, techniques, materialistic techniques for spiritual experience. So that leads eventually into the suppression, the outlawing of psychedelics in 1964, and from there you see the counterculture explode, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, Leary gets arrested in 71, yada, yada, yada. 70, the crackdown on drugs by the U.S. government moves into a place where the 1980s, you see somebody like Terence McKenna now kind of take the mantle of the use of psychedelics or drugs for spiritual purposes. And this brings in, and you see a new blending. Even when Timothy Leary comes out of prison, you see the 1980s, that psychedelic spirituality, drug-induced mysticism begins to blur with the technosphere, technology, computers, cybernetics. Why? I argue because they're technologies of transcendence. That part of this materialistic spirituality being rooted in the use of drugs, it ingratiates itself with the use of computers. And so we look at the effect of computers and even the sort of millenarian expectations of people like a Timothy Leary or like a Terence McKenna, that the computers, that the technology was going to bring salvation. And so there's not a whole lot of difference between the use of a drug as a technology or a technique, a techne, and technology, digital technologies and cybernetics itself. And this is where you can see then moving into the 21st century that psychedelically infused spirituality, drug-induced mysticism, I think has a lot of presuppositional relationships with the spiritual perspective of technology itself, whether it be the singularity or transhumanism. Because if the point is ultimately human transformation through the use of drugs or these mystical experiences, you can see how this would lead eventually to computers, uploading your consciousness to a computer, Neuralink, synthesizing yourself with various digital capabilities, digital contacts, right? All this different stuff is going to enhance humanity. You can even see how the internet and technology itself has created a single global hive mind, which is essential to Hermeticism, and Hermeticism being one of these archaic magical traditions that gets brought back into the Western mind during the Italian Renaissance. So you read something like, for example, like this paragraph here, this is from the very famous book, Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition by Francis Yates, this is just a paragraph that I'm going to quote within my paper, for example. The argumentum ends on a note of ecstasy. This is her referring to Marsilio Ficino and reading and understanding what's going on in this Hermetic tradition, the Hermetic corpus that he's translating in Florence, Italy. Ends on a note of ecstasy, which reflects those Gnostic initiations with which the Hermetica are concerned. And this work, so Ficino believes, there shines a light of divine illumination. It teaches us how, rising above the deceptions of sense and the clouds of fantasy, we are to turn our mind to the divine mind, as the moon turns to the sun, so that Pymander and the divine mind may flow into our mind, and we may contemplate the order of all things as they exist in God. And this worship of the divine mind, or this sort of panpsychic reality, I think there's a lot of relationships there, subtle relationships with even the technological, the technosphere that we're moving into right now, the Great Reset. And so you can actually see the global hive mind, the global village, and the Great Reset, and many of the presuppositions of magic, or the yearnings for magic, the great wizard, the great magician, and even the great mystics through drug-induced mysticism. They all kind of coalesce into one thing. It's very, very interesting. And so you can see some of the millenarian expectations in like a Ray Kurzweil with his singularity, with his transhumanism, or you can also see the millenarianism in Terence McKenna, for example, was convinced that 2012 was going to be the point. What was it? Well, it may be when the time machines come back, and that's the end of history, because history ends where the transcending and the movement through space, the space-time continuum begins. So very, very interesting stuff there. But this is just part of the research that I'm working on right now in regard to these technologies of transcendence. I think it's very, very interesting to look at. And when you look at Christianity, why is it that you don't find many of the evidence of psychedelic use in Eastern Christianity and Eastern Orthodoxy, despite the Slavic people having cultural and linguistic relationships to the picking of mushrooms, which would be much more conducive and suitable to these psychedelic groups? You don't find it. You find it in the West. And I would argue you find it in the West because of the presuppositions of the West compared to the East. Again, God, history, and dialectic. The Hellenistic dialectical philosophy, the Hellenistic yearnings, that within the West, even though they don't have the same relationship to mushrooms as the Slavs, when you look into things like the psychedelic gospels, for example, where you can find, let me show you stuff, where you can find, mushrooms in Plain Corault, France, right here. Plain Corault, France, a depiction of Adam and Eve. Clearly, both of them are covering themselves with the cap of a mushroom. This is in Spain. This is Christ entering Jerusalem, and you see Christ being gifted what appears to be stems of mushrooms. Here's the here's a depiction of the purification of Isaiah's lips, where you see it appears to be they're giving him a mushroom. You follow, that's just within this one church in Spain, and you follow that around at the top of the ceiling, and you'll be brought to the towers of Jerusalem, where it appears to be they're cutting down mushrooms. And then that depicts the Last Supper with the same knives and what appears to be the same mushrooms. This is in a church within Spain. This is within the Psalter of Canterbury. You see God creating plants. Well, it looks like he's creating one type of plants, if you ask me. You can see strange depictions within the stained glasses of Western Catholicism. You can see this depiction right here And this is in Hildesheim, Germany. And so there's the bishop, Bishop Bernard of Hildesheim, that there's apparently believed, at least argued by scholar Jerry and Julie Brown, that when you look at the pillar by Bernard of Hildesheim, it actually looks as if it's covered within, again, indicating psychedelic mushroom use. And there has been mycologists in Germany that have confirmed that the mushrooms depicted within this metal sculpture, that they actually are indicative of local indigenous mushrooms that are psychoactive, a form of psilocybin. So you find a bishop within the Catholic Church actually potentially promoting the use of psychoactive mushrooms, potentially the use of Amanita muscaria, potentially the use of psilocybin. This is very interesting stuff. Why not in the East? The people who are converting to Eastern Orthodoxy seems like they would be more likely to it. Now, maybe there is. I have not seen any clergy of the Eastern Orthodox Church throughout history actually support or have any sort of esoteric Eucharistic tradition of using psychedelic mushrooms or any inebriating substance. But we do have evidence of it in the West. And I would say it goes from there into the Western esoteric traditions, the magical traditions, from there into people like the Aldous Huxleys of the world, into the Timothy Learys, the Terence McKennas, and now we are existing in a sort of, I would call it psychedelic spirituality or an psychedelic esotericism that is present here in Western society. Western society. I don't know. This is my general, I'm working through this idea, but this is what I want to talk to you about, this general concept, with some of the with the book that I want to read to you guys. So this is the stuff I want to share. Just for those of you who are more academically minded, you can see. So some of the books that I'm using right now is The Road to Eleusis. This is about psychedelic use in the Eleusinian mysteries. This is Persephone's Quest. This is a really important book in Theogens and the Origins of Religion. R. Gordon Wassen, Jonathan Ott, Carl A.P. Ruck. Here's another book I'm using. Hallucinogens and Shamanism, talking a lot about indigenous use here. This is obviously a very important book. Shamanism, Mircea Eliade, archaic, what is it? Techniques, techne of ecstasy. So even within the very important book by Mircea Eliade, we see this concept of shamans using techniques, techne, again from the Greek word technologies for ecstasy, is rooted within shamanism itself. So saying that the techniques, the technology, the techne of the ancient world has continually been perpetuated throughout time, that it's never been broken, really, that this has always been with us to one degree or another. And I think it induces it's sort of materialistic spirituality because it calls into questions things that are spiritual versus physical. Now, as us as Orthodox, we don't have that same dialectic. So you could say, if you were promoting the psychedelic shamanism stuff, you could say, well, we don't have that dialectic between sacred, profane, material versus spiritual. Okay. But it is interesting. At least academically, it calls some things into questions. This is another interesting book. The Apples of Apollo, Pagan and Christian Mysteries of the Eucharist, Carl A.P. Ruck. As you can see here, this is a depiction by Jakob Burma, again, another famous esotericist in Western civilization. This is his, what is this called? The Christi Testamenta, and you see right in the center, at least according to these scholars, it looks as if there's a mushroom right at the heart, right at the crux of the cross. Is this a particular secret mystery or secret magical or secret tradition that has persisted from the ancient world into Christianity? I'm not saying it's Orthodox. I'm saying it's obviously heretical, but it is interesting how it particularly flourishes in Western Europe. I'm using this book, Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition by Francis A. Yates. Mushrooms, Myth and Mythros, The Drug Cult of Civilized Europe, Carl A.P. Ruck. The Affluence of Deity. See right here, here's another depiction. This is at the Baptistry of Parma, Italy. A baptistry in Parma, Italy, which also has Mithraic statuary above the doorway, molding, Mithraic molding. Again, in the mystery traditions of Mithras were known for using inebriating substances. And so this one right here, you see, well, it looks to be the transfer, or what is this? I forget what it's depicting. It's right above the Dormition of the Theotokos. But why Christ standing in top of what appears to be an Amanita muscaria mushroom? Interesting stuff. But again, only in Western Europe do you find this stuff. The Hidden World, I shared this one. I read parts of this book with you guys before. Survival of Pagan Shamanic Themes in European Fairy Tales. It's typically all Germanic. It's all Western stuff. Also, some books that I'm using. Obviously, the Psychedelic Gospels from Jerry and Julie Brown. It claims the secret history of hallucinogens in Christianity, of which is interestingly entirely in the Western form of Christianity. This is a really good academic book by Wouter Hanegraaff, Rejected Knowledge in Western Culture, Esotericism in the Academy. This is a book where it has his very popular article, Wouter Hanegraaff, in Theogenic Esotericism. I'm not advising anybody to buy this stuff unless you're really interested in the esoteric traditions like myself, but these are very good scholastic books. This is the other book written by Christopher Partridge. Again, very, very dense stuff. He comes at it in a very nice, objective way, although he's much more sympathetic than maybe us would be. I would recommend buying some of this stuff. This book particularly, it's a little expensive. It's almost $100, but it is dense with information. Here's another book by Wouter Hanegraaff, New Age Religions in Western Culture, Esotericism in the Mirror of Secular Thought. I got so many books around me, guys, you wouldn't believe it. Here's Breaking Open the Head by Daniel Pinchbeck. Here's the famous book by Timothy Leary, The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Here's some of McKenna's popular books, Foods of the Gods, The Archaic Revival, The Invisible Landscape. All these things I'm using for my research. That's the only reason I'm sharing them with you guys. But this is what we're going to get into today, or at least really not in. I'm just going to be reading. The rest of this stream is going to be reading chapters from this book here that I think are very, very interesting. It's going to bring information that you guys had never heard of and connect thoughts and concepts that you guys probably aren't aware of. So this is why I want to do that today. Before we dive into it, though, I do want to say that we have a theology course tonight with my godfather, Subdeacon Mark. We'll be diving into Eastern Orthodox theology. If this is something you'd like to join, you can do so with my Linktree link. So let me post my Linktree link here in the live chat. Just go over and follow my Telegram, whether it's my Church of the Eternal Logos Telegram or my group chat Telegram, and you will be able to follow me there, and I will be posting the Zoom link to our class right before 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock. So I got about an hour. I got to hurry and get through this book so I can be ready for that class. Also, guys, if you would appreciate what I'm doing here on Church of the Eternal Logos and you'd like to support, please become a website member. I'd greatly appreciate that. As I promised before, we got new exclusive video content up over at the website. If you'd like to hear the funny story of me getting arrested after my high school graduation, that video is up over at the website, along with the second half of my Mysticism stream, along with my speech from Montanica, along with my speech from the Trad Forum. Multiple videos up over at the website. Stories about ayahuasca experience, stories about going to Thelema ritual, stories about getting jumped in China. And there's more to come. But if you would be interested in supporting Church of the Eternal Logos, you like what I'm doing, please go over to the website and become a website member. I would greatly appreciate that for $5 a month. Also, if anybody would be interested in signing up for a one-on-one, you'd like to talk about theology, philosophy, world religions, mysticism, Western esotericism, magic, life, fitness, you can do so with the link that I'm posting right now in the live chat. This is to sign up for one-on-ones. You sign up and I will send you an email setting up a time in which we could jump into a Zoom meeting and discuss whatever it is you would be interested in. So with that being said, now I want to read again this book to you guys. We're going to go through each chapter and we're going to read the concluding comments. So each one I want to add, I want to add a text box to the screen here. And That way, each chapter, I can go ahead and write the chapter title. So you can see here some of the chapter titles. This is going to be focusing on modernism. So from the 19th century forward, what is the use of drugs for mystical purposes? And this is really interesting. So some of the chapter titles, first it is the technologies of transcendence. Then it's opium dreams and how opium was used in the British Empire in the early 19th century. The art of dreaming, the English opium eater. How many of you guys are aware of like Fitzhugh Ludlow and Berthollet and all the different people of the 19th century that were eating hash, eating opium, and then writing about these experiences, whether it be in France or England. So he talks a little bit about the opium dreams. Then he talks about the anesthetic revelation. The anesthetic, meaning talking about the anesthetization of people through various drugs. The anesthetics, right? So that anesthetics were used in the 19th century as ways for mystical revelation. I've talked to you guys briefly about the very important American scholar William James and how William James was even getting caught up in this stuff in the end of the 19th century and moving into the 20th century. How he experimented with nitrous oxide. He experimented with anesthetics and various other things. And many of these thinkers were talking about how it is producing mystical experiences. And so this is a continual thread, the technologies of transcendence, using different drugs, different substances for transcendence. And so this leads to hashish use. This leads to occultism in the 19th and 20th centuries. This leads to the antipodes of the mind, the revolution of the head, and then psychedelic shamanism. And we're going to read again all the concluding commentary on each chapter. So, technologies of transcendence. Okay, so chapter 1. Again, I got to be quick today, guys. I'm sorry if it feels like, geez, Patrick, you're speaking really fast. It's because we have our theology course, Eastern Orthodox theology course, starting at 7 tonight. So if you'd like to join, follow me over on Telegram. You can get a link to that. So the first one, I'm going to be reading the conclusion of chapter 1, the technologies of transcendence. This idea that technologies or techniques, materialistic means are being used to induce spiritual experience. Now, not obviously you can find them all over the historical world in regards to religions. Jay Dyer says, hey, I would like you to do an analysis of this video because of the esoteric pagan themes, Germanic paganism, and shrooms. Okay, what is it? Open. Oh, it won't open. It says, oops, something went wrong. Yeah, Jay, feel free to send it to me, man. I would definitely check it out. It's not letting me open up the link for some reason when I click it. So send it to me on one of the social medias. And shout out to Jay Dyer. Thank you so much, brother, for all your work. God bless you and Jamie. Hope all is well. So reading the first chapter of this book, again, what book are we reading? A very interesting and scholastic book called High Culture, Drugs, Mysticism, and the Pursuit of Transcendence in the Modern World. So the modern use, specifically the 1800s into the 20th century and the 21st century, the use of drugs. So what I want to start with is the concluding analysis, the drug problem, he calls it. And so it reads as following. The aim of this chapter has been to provide a preliminary overview of drugs as technologies of transcendence, along with some analysis of the principal ways in which psychedelic states have been interpreted. The significance of these ideals will become apparent in the following chapters. Again, he's going to get into opium, hashish use, anesthetics, especially at the end of the 1800s and into the 20th century. While many volumes have been devoted to examining the nature and significance of mystical experience, there is no doubt that psychoactive substances do induce what are commonly understood as experiences to be mystical states. As Robert Masters and Gene Houston found in a setting providing religious stimuli, from 75 to 90% of psychedelic subjects report experiences of religious or even something akin to a mystical nature. For example, Jane Dunlop, yada, yada, yada. Actually, we're going to skip this first chapter. It does talk about here Huxley, though. In the final analysis, Bedford commented regarding the concern which Huxley's work was received, the use of psychedelic goes against the grain of what is left of our Christian or Puritan tradition. Furthermore, the case of psychedelic mysticism in the West has not been helped by the so-called war on drugs, a term coined by Richard Nixon, yada, yada, yada. Actually, this first chapter is not that good. Okay, let's get to the next one, actually. So the next one is opium dreams, the use of opium. The use of opium for drug-induced mystical experience. Not only were De Quincy, so who wrote the Opium Eater. Okay, so Thomas De Quincy. For those of you who don't know, how many of you guys ever heard of Thomas De Quincy? Thomas De Quincy. He's actually very he's a famous author. He wrote the Opium Eater. Opium Dreams. Okay. Not only were De Quincy's 19th century accounts of the fierce chemistry and the exotic pleasure of recreational opium use the first of their kind, but as we will see, they are particularly influential. As David Courtwright discusses, while it is impossible to determine accurately the overall impact of De Quincy's Confessions of an Opium Eater on rates of addiction, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that the use of opium as a stimulant to the imagination was closely tied to his narratives. Although the confessions touched on many subjects, the passages contemporaries found most intriguing were those that dealt with De Quincy's fantastic opium dreams. It was, he says, easy for the reader to conclude that he, too, might journey through fantastic inner realms if only he downed a little opium. We have seen that De Quincy was not alone in developing theories of opium as technologies of transcendence. His thinking in this regard was fundamentally indebted to the social and cultural context of early 19th century Europe, particularly Romanticism, Idealism, and Orientalism, which have likewise continued to have a formative influence on the history of drugs and transcendence in the modern world. A central theme in the history of modern psychedelic thought is the notion that psychoactive substances initiate a transcendence of the mundane, occasioned by a migration from one form of consciousness to another. As a psychoactive substance begins to manipulate brain function and induce alterations in perception, mood, and consciousness, the self is, as De Quincy put it, transported to, quote, another world, taken out of the region of human things, human purposes, and human desires. Indeed, as we will see in Chapter 3, this is precisely what is experienced by Humphrey Davy, who was able to induce, by inhaling nitrous oxide, a loss of, quote, all connection with external things. He records that he seemed to exist, quote, in a world of newly connected and newly modified ideas. The key question concerns the nature of this other world. Although we have seen that James, like De Quincy, was typically hesitant about asserting its objectivity, and that he understood it to be primarily a construction of the mind, meaning the various mystical experiences people had. Nevertheless, he resisted accounting for it in entirely subjective terms. Following Coleridge, there is an attempt, since in this imagination or drug-induced mysticism can be interpreted as a dimension of reason and its peculiar function, comprehending both the whole and its parts and the parts of the whole. Not only does the imagination serve to animate the world, but in so doing it allows one to embrace the polarities of existence that often trouble the scientific mind directed to the phenomenal world of sense perception, which seeks to analyze, classify, measure, and dissect in order to understand. That is to say, the imagination seems to possess the ability to identify with a level of reality beyond that perceived by the senses. Furthermore, while some grasp that the belief in the peculiar power of the disciplined imagination helps us toward an understanding of the romantic fascination with altered states of consciousness, it is the case for De Quincy we have seen rather tantalizing the appearance of entities or manifestations within dream states that appear to have volitional independence and that seem to be able to reveal knowledge not previously known to the individual. But again, the objectivity of this knowledge is incredibly questionable. This raises a question to the ontological nature of drug-induced altered states, which became linked to romantic understandings of the significance of dreaming, and later to James's theories of the other forms of consciousness. He's talking about William James and the varieties of religious experience. This book right here, if you guys have read this, again, very important American philosopher and pragmatist William James talks about the variety of consciousness and conscious experience. Regardless of the psychotherapeutic potential of such states, there is arguably significant the fact that they are perceived in heterotopic spaces, other spaces, which exist alongside but are distinct from hegemonic society and culture, has been central to much of psychedelic discourse. For Foucault is helpful here as well. He identified two forms of space, utopias and heterotopias. The former are essentially unreal spaces, and he's talking about Michel Foucault, the pederast, homosexual that was a professor over at Berkeley in the 1960s. Michel Foucault was essential and as a sort of mainstream philosopher in the 1960s counterculture. He weaponized the idea of like power knowledge, this type of stuff. He identified two forms of space, utopias and heterotopias. They present society itself in a perfected form, or else society turned upside down. But in any case, these utopias are fundamentally unreal spaces. Heterotopias, on the other hand, are both real spaces and counter spaces, in that they remain absolutely different from all the sites that they reflect or speak about. That is to say, they exist alongside the spaces of mainstream society, but are distinguished from them. One might, for example, create a Zen garden in the center of London that is similar to such gardens found in Kyoto, but which bears little relationship to the life and space it occupies. For De Quincy, although the power of opium lay in its ability to work with the imaginary of the brain, and so doing it enabled an access to paradise. Oh, just subtle and mighty opium, quote unquote, thou buildest upon the bosom of darkness, out of the fantastic imagery of the brain, cities and temples beyond the arts of Philiatus, beyond the splendor of Babylon. Thou only givest these gifts to man, and thou hast the keys to paradise. Oh, just subtle and mighty opium. And you'll hear these revelries also reiterated by people like, what's going on? Dude trying to tell me to shut up for asking COTEL to analyze. Well, So you'll see these revelries about opium also be reiterated by the Thelemites, somebody like Aleister Crowley, and even, as we'll see in this book, Helena Blavatsky, it comes out, she also was using opium and hashish use in part of her theosophic adventures. On the other hand, such inner spaces might be perceived as objectively real heterotopias, which exist alongside the empirical spaces of everyday life. Of course, Foucault was not speaking of internal space, although he recognized the importance of such spaces. However, because of the ambiguous nature of inner space with psychedelic discourse, the notion of heterotopias can be usefully applied to altered states. Concerning the therapeutic potential of psychoactive drugs, we have seen that they can be thought of as technologies of transcendence, not simply in the mystical sense, but also in the related sense that they enable individuals to transcend, that is, to give new meanings and to reconfigure their situations, as De Quincy has constrained to do regarding certain traumatic formative events in his childhood. And a beautiful and insightful passage in Suspiria, in which he addresses his younger self, he discusses the countless mysterious handwritings of grief and joy which have inscribed themselves successfully upon the pamphlets of your mind, and, like an annual leaves of aboriginal forests and undissolving snows of the Himalaya. He then makes the point that, quote, by the searchings of opium, all these can revive in strength. They are not dead, but sleeping. He continues, the deep, deep, deep tragedies of infancy, as well as the child's hands, were unlinked and forever from his mother's neck, or his lips forever from his sister's kisses. These remain lurking below all, and these lurk at the last. Prefiguring James's reflections on altered states of consciousness, he understood that the drug, in terms of Gnostic technology for the parting of, quote, the veil between our present consciousness and the secret inscriptions of the mind. Finally, in relation to the above, it is also worth noting a comment made by De Quincy that emphasizes the importance of sociocultural contexts of the user. If a man whose talk is of oxen, one should become an opium eater. The probability is that if he is not too dull to dream at all, he will dream about oxen. De Quincy does not consider himself to be such a man. Rather, like Coleridge, he insists, a philosopher. His readers should therefore not be surprised that the phantasmagoria of his dreams is suitable to one who is in that character. In the other words, he stresses the importance of linguistic and sociocultural contexts in the construction of conceptual frameworks within which the opium eaters make sense of their experience. Regardless of the provocative ambiguity of this work, De Quincy questions the notion that humans are able to have narcotic dreams free of sociocultural conditioning. So, that was chapter 2. Now this is Anesthetic Revelation. This is, for those of you who don't know, like Friedrich Meyer was who got into. I have a whole book over here on many of the research that Friedrich Meyer did regarding like telepathy, telekinesis, all this different stuff. That who knew that anesthetics were also used for as a technology of transcendence in the late 19th century. So in the 1800s, the who's who of the European elite, they would actually find doctors to put them under anesthesia so they could have these quote-unquote mystical experiences. And so he goes through this whole thing in this chapter. He talks about a ladder to the heaven of heavens. He talks about some of the research that was going on in labs in England as well as France. He gets into stuff, how this was also becoming popularized in America, Anesthesia and the Society for Psychic Research. So again, Frederick William Henry Myers. Frederick Myers. This is a gentleman worth looking up. Go Google Frederick Myers and the Society for Psychic Research. This was over in England. I have a whole book on some of the stuff that they found. It's very, very interesting. But anyways, this is the concluding comments on this chapter, talking about anesthesia and anesthetics used as a technology of transcendence. At the turn of the 19th century, there was an unprecedented focus on the significance of the self. As Andrew Cunningham and Nicholas Jardin have commented, quote, "The major critical movements of the period which affect the arts and sciences are the enterprises of self-understanding. Questions about the nature of the divine, the nature of humanity, the nature of creativity, the nature of genius, and so on were all essentially questions about self-understanding in the context and scope of human knowledge, and about the power of reach of the individual's cognitive faculties. Furthermore, as might be expected during this period, the interrogation of the self tended to be informed by the Christian myth that attributes humanity's current condition to the primeval fall from the ideal state." Now, obviously, you and I, as Orthodox Christians, we believe in the fall. This accounts for death and sin and all these different things. But for these people, they were responding against this narrative, this hegemonic narrative in the Western world, and that's what he's referring to. Again, remember, this author has sympathies to this type of culture, but he does do very, very good work. Once in the golden age, in the garden before the fall, man was at one with himself and nature. Now he is divided in himself. He is once harmoniously united faculties at war with each other and at odds with nature. He is the, quote, "sour grapes of nature's sweet clusters," unquote. How is the lost unity of the self and nature to be restored? Of course, the traditional response to this question was eschatological. Because there was no hope in this life of recovering that original innocent state, we would have to wait for some post-mortem utopium. As the romantic dramatist Heinrich von Kleist declared, quote, "Paradise is bolted and barred, and the cherubim is behind us. Indeed, with the Romanticism, there was a common tendency to adapt some understanding of history as consisting of three stages: a prelapsarian past in which humans lived in harmonious communion with God and creation, Eden, the one, the present disharmony determined by its separation from God and creation, and the future reconciliation and the return to a prelapsarian state of health and harmony. Also popular during the 19th century was the notion that although we now, quote, dwell in the age of fragmentation, we all possess some kernel of the original one within ourselves, which tended to be understood in terms of divine immanence. As Andrew Swinson notes, not only can we experience the presence of the divine deep within ourselves, but we also can sense the presence of the divine within other things as well as the cosmos within ourselves. Kind of new agey, you can take that. These ideas help us toward an understanding of how anesthesia was interpreted during this period. First, the world of fragmentation can be transcended and oneness can be experienced, the unity discussed within romantic idealism. Second, the sense of euphoria, the relief of pain, and the perception of unity with nature produced by anesthetics all seem to suggest that they were technologies that enabled the self to unbolt the gates to paradise and to unlock within human experience an understanding of reality that transcended the effects of the fall. In short, anesthetics induced an experience of the lost and longed for ideal state. Third, as the effects of the fall apply to all, so relief from its effects and revelation of the ideal state are fundamentally democratic, in that they can be experienced by all. More specifically, such egalitarian technology seemed able to open up spaces within which many individuals could experience, quote, gnosis, a higher truth beyond that afforded by convoluted philosophical reasoning, scientific experimentation, and orthodox religion. Again, this egalitarianism is a central feature of the psychedelic mysticism. Fourth, following and directly from above, anesthetics were understood by some to contribute to a, quote, third way between orthodox science and orthodox religion pursued by the Society for Psychic Research. They appeared to enable access to, quote, deeper subliminal levels of truth. This was significant, for there was a general acceptance of Coleridge's thesis that all truth is a species of revelation. As Guy de Maupassant described his own experience of ether in his autobiographical story, it was a prodigious keenness of reasoning, a new manner of seeing, of judging, of estimating things of life with the absolute consciousness, the certitude that this manner was the true one. It seemed to me that I had tasted of the tree of knowledge, that all the mysteries had become unveiled. And this is a common theme within the psychedelic stuff, is they will venerate, because of their Gnostic sympathies, they will venerate Eve as the heroess, the heroine of the fall from grace, the fall of Adam and Eve. They'll actually venerate Eve as saying, no, that mean bad God in the Old Testament was trying to keep us unlike himself or unlike the rest of the Trinity, and therefore it was Eve that rescued us by eating from the tree of knowledge. You'll see this being reiterated by the 19th century scholars. You'll see this reiterated then by Aldous Huxley, then into Timothy Leary, then into Terence McKenna, and now it's almost a fixture within the psychedelic mysticism. The Anesthetic Revelation could be likened to the movement from when Adam eats fruit from, quote, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, in that while he may have lost his innocence, he experienced a level of understanding previously limited to God. This, of course, is essentially a Gnostic reading of the myth, exactly. As Bernard Reardson notes in his discussion of Hegel's interpretation of the fall, quote, as soon as a more or less literal reading of the myth has been abandoned, the sin of Adam is bound to be construed as in some manner of elevation, or at any rate of a broadening and enrichment of his nature. Unquote. This is precisely how the anesthetic revelation was understood. It was a direct route to a profound understanding of the nature of reality. Fifth, the event of anesthetic revelation was understood to be a self-authenticating and ultimately self-authoritative. Blood insisted by anesthetics enable a person to graduate, quote, beyond instruction in spiritual things, unquote. Consequently, the experience itself is epistemically epistemically necessary. That is to say, because it constitutes a form of consciousness fundamentally, quote, discontinuous with ordinary consciousness, it has to be known experientially. Blood is reluctant, and Blood is a scholar, by the way. Blood is reluctant to use the term knowledge, for what is revealed cannot be taught from a pulpit or communicated in philosophical text. Again, while he does not use the term, it is better understood as gnosis. Individuals have to taste the fruit of the tree of knowledge for themselves. And you see this emphasis on spiritual experience, phenomenology, this type of thing. 6, the perception of unity experienced during the Anesthetic Revelation was so enveloping and profound that it seemed to demand a monistic interpretation of reality, which you find in all, going back to shamanism, going back to Timothy Leary's psychedelics, going back to Terence McKenna, monism. Alan Watts, his sort of dialectical monism, that good and evil, well, they're yin and yang. They go together. They're all one. You are the universe experiencing itself. There's two different things, but you're all one. Monism is a consistent theme in all these inebriating cults and the psychedelic cults, the ancient mystery traditions, or even the use of anesthetics during the 19th century. Guys, please smash that like if you could. Greatly appreciate it. Let's see, we're talking about, I insist emphatically. This is John Middleton Murray in 1929. I insist emphatically that, to me, the element of pure experience in both mystical and anesthetic experiences is indistinguishable insofar as both constitute in immediate awareness of an all-pervading unity. Even thinkers such as Ramsey and James, who are particularly resistant to post-Kantian idealism, found themselves turning to its concepts in order to articulate their experiences. All contradictions and opposites were transcended in a cogent perception of cosmic oneness. This was certainly the case for Blood, although he eventually abandoned monism, largely, I suspect, because of the influence of James, who was critical of the aspect of his thought. In the Anesthetic Revelation, he seems convinced of its accuracy and the interpretation of the nature of reality. Men and brethren, into this one pervading genius we pass, forgetting and forgotten, and thenceforth each is all in God. There is no higher, no deeper, no other than the life in which we are founded. Unquote. And you see, that sounds exactly like Alan Watts. But this is early 20th century, late 19th century, and this is highs off the using of anesthetics. The one remains, the many changes and pass, and each and every one of us is the one that remains. You would think that was Alan Watts. Even in his posthumously published work, The Plural Verse, an essay in the philosophy of pluralism, which argues that reality is irreducible to a single principle, the one, i.e. Neoplatonism. He insists that the experience of anesthetic revelation is a direct challenge to pluralism. It presents a, quote, unequivocal impasse whose obstruction can neither be obviated nor defined. Finally, the Gnostic transcendence of embodied existence is a marked feature of the anesthetic revelation. This is particularly interesting when one considers that up until the 19th century, the care of the sick was informed by a commitment to the belief that pain and disease were a direct result of sin, the consequence of the fall. Consequently, there was some unease about interfering with the inscrutable purposes of God by reducing pain, not least bit childbirth. However, the development of anesthetics significantly contributed to the erosion of these attitudes during the 19th century. Not only did they alleviate pain, but they also induced an experience of the transcendence of embodied existence. There was a sense in which, as John Addington Symonds puts it, one was able to catch, quote, a glimpse of the eternal process, unquote. That is to say, the anesthetic revelation provided a syntax, as Molly found, a, quote, sweet foretaste of what we hope with souls more chaste, to breathe through a perpetual spring, when death was dropped his venomed sting, unquote. In other words, a visit to the dentist could lead both to relief from the effects of the fall, as well as an experience of heavenly bliss. And now we move into Hasidism. he calls it Hashidom, but he's talking about the use of hashish. The use of hashish. All right. And thank you guys for the super chats. I will be getting to those once I finish. As you know, I have our theology course tonight, so I'm trying to hurry and get through this. So here is the section on hashish use. And I want to share this with you guys. This is on hashish use. And so remember that the Muslims, and we're going to read about the Arabian Nights, again, the story of Aladdin. This is actually filled with a tradition of smoking hashish. Hashish was very, very popular in Islam during this time. So at least that's how the opium and the hashish dens of France, Paris, England, London, that's where they get a lot of this stuff from the Muslims. So here we go. This is the concluding comments in chapter 4 on hashish. Any adequate understanding of the reception of hashish in the West requires a grasp of the romantic Orientalism milieu within which the drug was thought about and consumed, the set and setting of the 19th century consumer of cannabis. It is not difficult to trace the interpretations of hashish as a technology of transcendence back to Orientalist constructions of the East. One only has to consider that the very term hashish arrived in the West freighted with exotic baggage from the East, which, when unpacked, was shown to be conspicuously influenced by the Arabian Nights and the legend of the assassins. Interestingly, again, note that the use of inebriating substances always have a sort of Oriental fascination, whether it be Helena Blavatsky and her theosophy, looking at Hinduism, particularly the tantric traditions, looking at Buddhism, whether it be Aleister Crowley, looking at tantric forms of Buddhism in Tibet, looking at different forms of magic, even looking at the roles of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, for example, by Timothy Leary, the use the obsession with Orientalism by Terence McKenna. Although I think it takes on a more paganistic feel, as Terence McKenna represents a sort of new phase of the psychedelic, the tools of transcendence, these technologies. It moves from a sort of a fascination with Orientalism into a new sort of pagan cybernetic spirituality. And so when you get the mixture of the paganism, the worship of nature, and the cybernetic spirituality, I think you can see fertile presuppositions for people to accept the New World Order, the Great Reset, the global village, the hive mind, all this different stuff that we're now witnessing being put in place that ultimately we see as demonic and representing of the spirit of the Antichrist. I think there's a lot of presuppositions within the technologies of transcendence, and that especially post Terence McKenna, paganism and cybernetics fused together along with psychedelics, and it's a new spirituality. Anyways, continuing now with the 19th century use of hashish and their emphasis on Orientalism. The languid exotic dream states produced by Hassan's elixir could now be experienced in Europe. This link between hashish and the Orient, for example, evocatively portrayed the Gaetano Praviati's 1887 painting La Hashish, which depicts a group of women reclining on oriental furnishings, enjoying the hazy bliss of hashish intoxication. And the Count of Monte Cristo, Dumas embeds a discussion of the celestial joys of hashish intoxication within a narrative that conflates the legend of the assassins and a reference to the Arabian Nights. Masquerading as Sinbad the sailor, the protagonist, Edmond Dantes, constructs an oriental setting which he relates stories of Hassanin bin Sabah and persuades his guest, Baron Franz de Epinay, to experience the wonders of the, quote, the purest and the most unadulterated hashish from Alexandria, unquote. Ah, says Sinbad of Franz, those Orientals, they are the only men who know how to live, unquote. The hashish experience in the late 19th century France was imagined as a, quote, magic carpet ride, unquote. This was not to say that every 19th century pothead had a sophisticated grasp of these ideas, but only that there was an early cultural link between hashish and Orientalist constructions of the exotic East. Consequently, by the late 19th century, the states of transcendence produced in the pursuit of the most, quote, remarkable phenomenon, whether incense-scented dreams or genie-haunted nightmares, tended to have an oriental or paranormal, if not explicitly mystical hue. Confluent with the turning toward the East was also the frequently articulated romantic idealist bias. As Baudelaire and Ludlow discuss, one of the principal experiences of hashish intoxication is the transcendence of space and time. The user can be anywhere and everywhere at once. This is, in turn, often confluent with an erosion of the distinct identity of the self. From time to time, says Baudelaire, the, quote, personality vanishes, unquote, as the self emerges with its environment. Quote, now you are a tree moaning in the wind and murmuring vegetal melodies to nature. Now you hover at the azules of an immensely extended sky, unquote. Every contradiction is now an identity. Man is a god. There are important points when considering hashish as a technology capable of inducing mystical states, and that directly relate to what Aldous Huxley referred to as, quote, the urge to transcend self-conscious selfhood. The experience of 19th century users was often also shaped by a pre-Christian set and setting. We have seen that Ludlow developed a form of psychedelic Gnosticism that was influenced by popular Christian theological anthropology and rooted in Neoplatonism. He experienced, for example, his incorporeal soul shaking, quote, the bars of the flesh mightily, as if determined to escape from its cage, unquote. Hashish, he believed, had the ability to release the soul from its material incarceration into the immaterial world from whence it came, what he refers to as, quote, eternity. While the identity of the self remains intact, one released from this embodied state is no longer constrained by the laws of the physical universe. Under the influence of hashish, he was able to experience the ages going by into eternity. Although a bias toward idealism is evident, it is tempered by the classical theism. A, quote, godlike sublimity swallowed up my soul. I was overwhelmed in a fathomless barothrum of time, but I leaned on God and was immortal through all changes, unquote. For Ludlow, this proved to be a powerful confirmation of the integrity and immorality of the soul, as he imagined would be his experience at death. He was able to stand outside his body, view the room which he was seated, and pass through its walls unhindered into the incorporeal eternal realm. As we will see in Chapter 5, these ideas quickly found their way into spiritualism. Also important in the 19th century spiritualism was the conception of two worlds, which Ludlow's work was informed by the Kantian distinction between the phenomenal and the noumenal. Although this needs to be understood carefully, it is an interesting idea that was developed in a number of directions. For example, we need to think of these not as ontologically distinct worlds, but rather as worlds of consciousness, that is rooted in a general perception that hashish induces a state in which, the Ernest Bloch puts it, the eternal world is rather blocked off, unquote. Such a state allows new remixed versions of reality to manifest because empirical reality is not completely occluded, quote, as it is in sleep, but only to the extent that it is not compatible with the images that appear, unquote. The external everyday world, argued Bloch, can, quote, appear to be on a plane of Parnassus, unquote. Benjamin, with whom Bloch took hashish, even records constantly passing between these two worlds during the experience. He recalls a, quote, alteration between dreaming and waking states, a constant and finally exhausting oscillation between totally different worlds of consciousness. Finally, it is worth noting that the experience of the two worlds is central to much psychedelic thought, as noted in Chapter 1. It is also a subversive political significance. For example, while for Bloch, this other world of consciousness was typically one of enchanting levity, which to the talented hashish dreamer becomes a request concert of wishes. For Benjamin, hashish intoxication was pregnant with revolutionary potential. The altered state could be used as a philosophical tool for social transformation, in that it enables the user to view the world in a non-habitual way. As discussed in Chapter 1 with references to Michel Foucault, hashish could be understood in terms of a countercultural technology of the self, which is able to contribute to the subversion of technologies of domination. This is important rather than simply understanding intoxication in terms of derangement of the senses or spiritual transcendence. Benjamin understood it as, quote, overcoming the rational individual, which in turn enables novel interpretations of everyday life. Ordinary moments are transformed into catalysts of illumination. Each under mundane objects or events can be seen in a completely new light, the effect of which is to prompt the subject to think differently to questions. This, however, is not religious enlightenment, but rather informed by a materialistic anthropological inspiration and driven by the energies of intoxication and its profane illumination. So this was hashish, and so very interesting. How many of you guys knew that there was hashish dens? The Hashish Eater by Fitzhugh Ludlow. He wrote that book in the 19th century. That De Quincy talking about eating opium. This stuff was really popular in the 19th century, guys. And when you read their stuff, you'd think you're reading Timothy Leary, Terence McKenna, and Alan Watts, because these technologies of transcendence induce a sort of similar phenomenological world, and the presuppositions of monism, the presuppositions of phenomenology, the presuppositions of a divine mind all lead nicely into really what we're seeing now in the spirit of the Antichrist, a full realization of this stuff materialistically in regards to digital technologies, transhumanism, the singularity, uploading one's consciousness. All this stuff really has a sort of logical follow if you believed in all this stuff moving back through the 19th century into the 20th. So now the next chapter is occultism in the late 19th and early 20th century. So looking at Aleister Crowley, the Theosophical Society of Helena Blavatsky, and all this different stuff. So let me put this in here. Okay, occultism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So this is chapter 5 here. So you're going to hear some names that you're probably going to, some notable names you've probably heard before. And so here we go. This is on occultism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We have seen that many of the themes that emerged during the fin de, it's French, I can't pronounce it, Cecile, originated before it, just as we would continue beyond it. Thinkers discussed in previous chapters, such as De Quincy, Ludlow, Baudelaire, Gautier, and the spiritualists discussed in this chapter, particularly Randolph and Cahagnet, nurtured ideas that subsequently found their way into the occulture. Whether or not, and so a culture is, he's saying occult culture. He's tying those words together and calling it a culture. Whether or not psychedelic esotericism would have developed in the way that it did without the hothouse environment is a matter of speculation. But what we do know is that this was a period during this transgression was fashionable. The popular imagination was haunted by Gothic tales of the paranormal. The public was fascinated by lurid reports of profane rituals. Powerful psychoactives were both legal and voguish. Addiction was as cool as heroin, as the heroin chick in the 1990s, and altered states were pregnant with occult meaning. Sometimes described in terms of la mal du Cecile, I don't even know what that means, provided the ideal cultural context within which to foster the relationship between drugs and the occult. That said, however, many during the 19th century expressed an ambivalence towards drugs. On the one hand, drugs were undoubtedly powerful psychoactive agents. On the other hand, apart from the moral issues surrounding drug use that clearly weighed on the minds of many spiritualists, there was also a sense of it as a vision that had induced, quote, artificiality. It did not carry the same authority of experiences induced by magical skill and spiritual forces. As Simmons recalls of Crowley, although, quote, he had been taking anhebolonium for some years, he did not want to reveal this in case anyone should think that his, quote, visions and conversations with the gods were only mescaline dreams, unquote. We will see that this resistance to what was perceived as occult shortcuts and a reliance on pseudo-spiritual states continued into the 20th century. Shaped by the cultural forces of the period, Crowley, who could almost have been a character created in the mind of the Hussamans, emerged as an archetypal occultist. His focus on sex, drugs, and mystical experience led to Regardier's view of him as the father of modern psychedelia, becoming an increasingly popular one within Western occulture. Indeed, it is often simply assumed that, as Francis King has insisted, quote, most occultists who have been taken a favorable attitude toward the use of consciousness-altering drugs have been influenced by Aleister Crowley, unquote. And think about it. You can look at Timothy Leary, Robert Anton Wilson, and Terence McKenna, all three people being influenced by Aleister Crowley, and all three promoting the same sort of drug-induced mysticism. Similarly, Don Webb, former high priest of the Temple of Set, is clear that Crowley introduced drugs to the West as a method of self-transformation. Likewise, Kazansky portrays Crowley as a psychedelic trailblazer, and Breeze declares him to be, quote, a pioneer in the use of entheogens, unquote. Breeze even claims that his short story, The Drug, of 1909, quote, stands as one of the first, if not the first, accounts of a psychedelic experience, unquote, and that he was responsible for fostering the use of drugs in literary and occult circles in Europe and America, unquote. Booth suggests that he should be placed, quote, as equal to Aldous Huxley as a writer and chronicler of the part drugs play in visionary experience, unquote, and that he had not, quote, developed such a notorious reputation, he would surely have been as seriously considered in due course as Huxley was for the publication of The Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell. Such assessments are not entirely wide of the mark in that Crowley was an important occultist who used drugs, but they do tend to overstate his significance. First, as we have seen in previous chapters, not only was creative drug use hardly a novel practice within literary and occult circles, but both Baudelaire's The Poem of Hashish and Ludlow's The Hashish Eater of 1857, both of which had a formative influence on Crowley's thought, predated his birth in 1875. Second, although it is important to recognize the significance of the link Crowley played between psychoactives and magic, we have seen that there had already been some reflection on this relationship. Cognat, Rudolph, Blavatsky, Bennett, Yates, and Ghosn had all, to varying degrees, given the matter some attention. More significant, we have seen that there is evidence to suggest that in the mid-1880s, Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor had already experimented with drugs during initiation ceremonies. Third, his writings on drugs was arguably too auteur, rhetorical and unsystematic to have had a cultural impact of Huxley's far more concise and erudite discussions. Finally, a distinction needs to be made between Crowley's influence as a profane icon and his influence as an occult thinker. While the idea of Crowley found its way into the burgeoning occulture of the 1960s, there is a question concerning the extent to which his ideas had a formative influence on psychedelia. The idea of Crowley as a symbol of transgression had a cultural impact. Not only was his image used by Peter Blake in the artwork for the Beatles' psychedelic classic Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club Band, but in the politics of ecstasy, Leary encodes his idea of Crowley with psychedelic meaning by identifying him as one of Britain's innovative trippers, heads, and stoned visionaries, noting that, quote, he experimented with every available drug as a means of transcendence, unquote, that he used peyote to, quote, turn on his audience at his lectures, unquote, and that he, quote, articulated the viewpoint that drug prohibition was not only useless, but actually intensified the problem of drug abuse, unquote. Art Klepps, who knew Leary well, has claimed that Crowley was Leary's, quote, hero. Leary even referenced the title of Crowley's hastily written drug book in the title of his own hastily written Confessions of a Hope Fiend, an account of his escape from the maximum security prison in San Luis Obispo in 1970. He also mentions Crowley several times in Confessions. Even Andy Warhol commented on the role of the counterculture in the, quote, evolution of society was similar to that of Aleister Crowley, the occult philosopher who scandalized the previous generation with his flamboyance and his libertarian ideas. Do what thou will is the whole of the law, unquote. However, it was primarily the idea of Crowley as a profane icon that appealed to the counterculture. There is relatively little evidence during the 1960s psychedelic revolution beyond the occult milieu and those who had a particular interest in Crowley's philosophy, such as Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, film director Kenneth Anger, and writer Robert Anton Wilson, that much detail was known about his thought, let alone his ideas regarding the esoteric significance of intoxication. He was a symbol of countercultural transgression, as Theodore Roszak commented in 1970 regarding the major article on Crowley in the underground paper International Times. Quote, the exuberant treatment goes no further than a sensational surface. It is the simple principle of inversion which too often dominates the underground press. The straight papers would have said, scandalous, we are marvelous. But understanding gets no further, unquote. Leary may have been an exception, but even so, there are actually only a few references to Crowley in his work and very little evidence of any significant influence. Part of the problem of the countercultural occultism was that, as Suster says, during the 1960s, Crowley's, quote, books were expensive and as hard to locate as the work of a Russian dissident, unquote. However, by the end of the decade, when the psychedelic counterculture was beginning to fade, a revival of interest in the occult had started to gain ground, central to which the republication of his works in affordable editions. Despite efforts, there was little attention given to Crowley's theories of drug-induced transcendence. Even today, this is still a neglected area in the study of Crowley's thoughts. Crowley's importance in the history of psychedelic mysticism relates principally to the way in which he was able to distill a number of ideas circulating within the time he possessed in a way that few others did, an intellectual arrogance, a charismatic authority, and a penchant for transgression that enabled him to immerse himself in the occulture and to surface with an eclectic, esoteric philosophy that inspired belief. Core themes of this period, such as the decline and rebirth, the romantic notion of a new age, were reimagined in terms of the passing of the Aeon or of Osiris, and the apocalyptic advent of the Aeon of Horus. If Nordau saw in Baudelaire's, quote, at once a mystic and an erotomaniac, unquote, inspired by visions, hashish, and opium, Crowley, even more than Randolph, was the epitome of this dark trajectory. Vice was transformed into virtue, the life of the senses, quote unquote. To quote the passage from Dorian Gray cited at the beginning of the chapter, quote, was described in terms of a mystical philosophy. Crowley made it difficult to know whether one was reading a spiritual ecstasies of some medieval saint or the morbid confessions of a modern sinner, unquote. His articulation of an approach that used, quote, the method of science to pursue the aim of religion was, of course, a development of ideas already in circulation. Not only have we seen similar approaches in the work of members in the Society of the Psychic Research Center, but Crowley explicitly drew on Jamesian ideas concerning psychological interrogation of mystical states. In particular, we have seen drugs emerge as technologies that enabled users to induce states of transcendence in a way that could be controlled and therefore examined. As such, they emerged as an important element in the reversal of the modern discourse that differentiated science and religion. Psychoactives were technologies that could be used to access forms of consciousness and perhaps other levels of reality. This brings us to one of the core themes discussed in the chapter. Drugs are able to relax the ties which bind the body to the soul, which you hear people talking about astral projection, stuff like this, and how some people, the spiritual attacks that occur when people loosen these attachments that bind the body and the soul. While we have seen that this experience has been central to modern psychedelic history, having been developed within Romanticism, it took on a particular significance within the late 19th century occultism. As Known remarked, if psychoactives could be used as technologies to release the self from its corporeal ties and therefore from the tyranny of the physical laws governing material existence, then, quote, how interesting and how useful. In the following chapters, we will see that this potential of psychoactives was continued and deemed to demand attention and to ensure a close relationship between drugs and mysticism. All right. So we are flying through here. I don't even know if I'll be able to finish before the theology course, actually. Antipodes of the Mind. So please smash that like, guys. Thanks for everybody being here. We're now going to dive into the Antipodes of the Mind. And the concluding comments of this chapter are as such. The cultural ripples caused by the impact of The Doors of Perception, book written by Aldous Huxley, and, to a lesser extent, Heaven and Hell, became waves by the dawn of the 1960s. Many aspiring mystics, typically working with Buddhist and Hindu ideas, agreed with Huxley that the house need not be burned down in order to roast a pig. There was little point in following the arduous path of asceticism if mystical states could be experienced simply by swallowing a psychedelic substance while sitting in a comfortable chair listening to one's favorite music. By the close of the 1950s, there was not only a burgeoning countercultural interest in Zen Buddhism, as evocatively described in Jack Kerouac's The Dharma Bums, but also a fascination with what Alan Watts referred to as adventures in the chemistry of consciousness, as discussed in the work of Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs. There was an emerging feeling, particularly amongst young people, that, as Watts put it, quote, modern chemists had prepared one or two substances that in some cases induced states of mind remarkably similar to cosmic consciousness. Having said that, while Watts became an enthusiastic advocate for Huxley's thesis, he had initially expressed concerns similar to Zahner's about spiritual shortcuts. Quote, for one thing, mystical experience seems altogether too easy when it simply comes out of a bottle, and is thus available to people who have done nothing to deserve it, who have neither fasted nor prayed nor practiced yoga. For another to claim seems to imply that spiritual insight is, after all, only a matter of body chemistry involving a total reduction of the spiritual to the material, unquote. And this is really important, guys, because if that is true, and that I think Zahner's hitting at a very important presupposition that if mystical states induced by drugs are equal to those which occur naturally through actually ascetic and spiritual practices, then spiritual knowledge, spiritual gnosis is really just materialistic processes. And if that is the case, then you can see why Neuralink is being promoted by these people. You can see the global hive mind. You can see the Great Reset. You can see the singularity. You can see how all this stuff fits into a spiritual worldview, because ultimately, even though they see themselves as being incredibly mystical and transcendent, the focus on drugs actually makes their worldview incredibly materialistic. It's incredibly materialistic. And so no wonder the same people that want to talk about, freeing themselves from the body and drugs and this or that are also the ones who are going to sign up for their Kufid passport, who are going to sign up for the global hive mind. They're going to sign up to be tracked by AI, because what's interesting regarding this drug-induced spirituality is the presupposition is somehow that matter is itself spiritual, in that it really just is a manipulation of brain chemistry. And if it's just a manipulation of brain chemistry, well, then we can just sit you in a chair, we can anesthetize you, and we can just make sure that your brain chemistry is put to a mystical state, and there you go. So I think this is a really important perceptive highlight here. However, as noted in Chapter 1, he decided that while these are serious considerations, it needs to be understood that the difficulty is found to rest upon the semantic confusion as the definitions of spiritual and material. In other words, the public concern about psychedelics rests on a false opposition of spirit and matter, one of the principal themes of his work. And obviously, we as Orthodox would say we don't have that same dialectic between spirit and matter, Christ's incarnation and God's incarnation as full human nature bridges that divine. So we don't have that same dialectic. So we can relate to somebody saying that's a false opposition, that's a false dialectic, but you can't help but notice that the mystical, the technologies of transcendence, the drugs actually induce a materialistic and overly materialistic form of spirituality in which you need not do anything to receive enlightenment or illumination. You don't need to be a moral person. You don't need to do this or that. You just take the drugs and you get it in exchange. So, yeah. In other words, the public concern about psychedelic rests on a false opposition of spirit and matter. On the principal themes of his work, as with Huxley and some of the principal currents in the 1960s psychedelic revolution, his overall point was that, quote, the use of such chemicals does not reduce spiritual insight to a mere matter of body chemistry, unquote. Indeed, quote, even when we can describe certain events in terms of chemistry, this does not mean that such events are merely chemical, unquote. Brain chemistry, altered states of consciousness, and spiritual experiences are fundamentally related. In response to criticisms such as those of Zarner, he argued that we need at least to consider the possibility that some of the chemicals known as psychedelics provide opportunities for mystical insight in much the same way that well-prepared paints and brushes provide opportunities for fine painting or a beautifully constructed piano for great music. Aha. Now the next chapter is chapter 7, The Revolution in the Head. This is really talking about the 1960s counterculture. The 1960s counterculture. Revolution in the Head. There we go. Okay. And so let's flip to this one. Okay, concluding comments with Revolution in the Head. Please smash that like, guys. And if you have any super chats, feel free to throw those in using the Streamlabs link. I will get to those at the end. The aim of this chapter and chapter 6 has been to explore the principal spiritual currents of the 20th century psychedelic heyday. Without wanting to be cynical, much of what went on and beyond the cloistered spaces of academia in the late 1950s and 60s amounted to a valorization of recreational drug use in a culture shaped by a turn to the self. Unquestionably, many young people simply enjoyed taking drugs. Steve, a hippie interviewed in 1967, recalled that when he and his friends first took LSD, quote, we didn't drop it to see God or overthrow the government. We did it because we liked it, unquote. Others, however, attached to their experiences a significance that gave them metaphysical weight. Allied to this was a desire to liberate themselves from the conservative political and religious values of the previous generation, the hegemonic Protestant Christianity of America. These ideas are central to understanding the social and cultural significance of psychedelic revolutions in the 1960s. Moreover, as with religious experiences generally, because psychedelic states were ineffable, their full significance could be properly appreciated only by other experiences, which led to the creation of distinct subcultures like minded users. Psychedelic subcultural capital was accrued by users as they shared their experiences and, in religious communities, interpreted them in ways that appealed to other users. These ideas were propagated, informed, and serviced by popular culture. Consequently, subcultures were bound together by an argot, a music scene, popular literature, urban legends, discourses of transcendence, and a shared culture. Some within the psychedelic counterculture worked with humanistic psychological theories and ideas emerging out of the human potential movement, much of which can be tracked back to Huxley's interest in the development of human potentialities. But if you really want to get into the human potential movement, you need to dive into a book. You need to go back to the Esalen Institute. The Esalen Institute. This is On the Edge of the Future, Esalen and the Evolution of the American Culture. I also have Jeffrey Kripal's book. His is very, very good on, I don't have it next to me. I think it's over there, on Esalen. If you want to know more about the human potential movement and Gestalt therapy and all that stuff, look into the Esalen Institute. Related to these currents and also indebted to Huxley are a range of derationalized religious ideas drawn from Eastern traditions. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that this was a period during which spiritual literature became enormously popular. Books such as the Tao Te Ching, the Psychedelic Experience, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Gurdjieff's Meetings with the Remarkable Men, Hesse's Siddhartha, Watts's Way of Zen, Eugen Herrigel's Zen in the Art of Archery, and of course The Doors of Perception by Huxley seem to attain almost scriptural weight for some readers. The turn east, the turn within, the turn to psychedelics were all part of some post-war sociocultural shift. Psychedelics tend to be interpreted as Gnostic technologies that were able to liberate the self from sociocultural conditioning. For example, in his survey of American Buddhists, Douglas Ostow found that, quote, one commonly occurring theme was the idea that psychedelics could act as a, quote, door or gateway. Many use the metaphor of psychedelics as opening a door to things such as Buddhist truths, other realities or places, spatial metaphors, or higher states of consciousness, unquote. They were used to induce, quote, egoless, or ego loss, ego death, unquote, or, quote, the melting away of the boundaries of the self, unquote. And we've talked about how psychedelics are tied to boundary dissolution, and this is why the transgenderism, the postmodernism, the relativistic epistemologies are interestingly tied up with the use of psychedelics. Having turned off the mind, relaxed and floated downstream and passed through the, quote, second bardo. Bardo are little, it describes the afterlife in Tibetan Buddhist theology, the bardos. A visionary experience, the individual properly trained, the, quote, yoga of drugs, unquote, might finally experience a process of rebirth, redemption from the constraints of everyday existence, a phenomenon referred to variously as illumination, nirvana, satori. However, it was interpreted users emerged from the psychedelic experience with a new understanding of the self, society, the divine, and reality. Although it was expressed in these terms, there was a clear sense of psychedelic gnosis. For a humanistic psychological perspective, some interpreted psychedelic transcendence in terms of what Maslow identified as peak experiences, which were identified with mystical experiences. Abraham Maslow himself was interested in psychedelic experiences as, quote, a new possibility for the scientific investigation of transcendence, unquote. And the last few, this is a quote from Abraham Maslow, the famous psychologist. In the last few years, it has become quite clear that certain drugs called psychedelics, especially LSD and psilocybin, give us the possibility to control in this realm of peak experiences. It looks as if these drugs often produce peak experiences in the right people under the right circumstances, so that perhaps we needn't wait for them to occur by good fortune. Perhaps we can actually produce a private personal peak experience under observation and whenever we wish under religious or non-religious circumstances. We may then be able to study in its moment of birth the experience of illumination or revelation. Even more important, it may be that these drugs could be used to produce a peak experience with core religious revelation and non-peakers, thus bridging the chasm between these two separated halves of mankind. Maslow also identified some of the core ideas in modern psychedelic history as technologies capable of inducing peak experiences. Psychedelics had both democratized mysticism and opened up to a scientific scrutiny. By the close of the 1960s, however, the effects of drug use were becoming a matter of some concern. At one end of the spectrum, the media and socially conservative groups were stoking the fires of a moral panic. Quote, stories about users of LSD trying to fly off building, plunging to their death, standing in traffic, trying to stop cars, staring at the sun and going blind were rife. As Charles Tart recorded in 1972 edition of the Altered States of Consciousness, he had been unable to update the section on psychedelic drugs published in the 1969 edition due to the fact that, quote, research came to a standstill because of public hysteria, unquote. At the under end of the spectrum, some were beginning to doubt the efficacy of the psychedelic experience to produce a meaningful or indeed healthy result. For example, Maslow became concerned that its risks being reduced to a merely experiential, unquote, Out of the joy and wonder of his ecstasies and peak experiences, he may be tempted to seek them ad hoc and to value them exclusively as the only or at least the highest goods of life, giving up on criteria of right or wrong. Impatience, especially the built-in impatience of youth, dictates shortcuts of all kinds. Drugs, which can be helpful when wisely used, become dangerous when foolishly used. Then sudden insight becomes all, and the patient and discipline, quote, working through is postponed or devalued. Instead of being surprised by joy, turning on is scheduled, promised, advertised, sold, hustled into being, and can get to be regarded as a commodity. Maslow's comments reflected the concerns of many at the end of the 1960s, particularly those concerned with spiritual progress. Even at Mellbrook is the mansion in upstate New York that Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Richard Alpert, who becomes Ram Dass later, where they move their research from Harvard. After getting kicked out of Harvard, they move it to Peggy Hitchcock's very wealthy estate, which was in upstate New York. It was a massive mansion, and basically they did all their research there from 63 to 66. Even at Millbrook, as we have seen, there was a growing interest in non-chemical techniques of transcendence. While many appreciated the significance of psychedelics as visionary technologies like Watts, they came to view them as only an initial step. People began to think that just taking a drug is in itself a spiritual practice, bemoaned Metzner, and it isn't, unquote. In the final analysis, it would seem that for many, the psychedelic revolution confirmed the suspicion that there could be no shortcuts to a healthy spiritual life. That said, many of those concerned about drug use, such as Metzner, were not advocating abstinence either. Rather, they believed it was important to learn from the excesses of the 1960s and use psychedelics more carefully and purposefully. In particular, they should be used in clinical or ritualized contexts. Quote, the way shamans in the Amazon do with ayahuasca and the Native American churches does with peyote, unquote. Metzner's point is that, quote, just taking a pill without the preparation and intention, unquote, has limited benefits. Psychedelics need to be combined, quote, with a sacramental attitude, unquote. Unfortunately, during the 1960s, quote, none of us knew any better. We just winged it as best we could with the limited knowledge and experience at our disposal, unquote. Overall, it's difficult to overestimate the significance of the, quote, psychedelic revolution. Although we have seen that there is a history of personal and scholarly interest in non-ordinary states of consciousness, the 1950s and 60s witnessed much important experimentation which, while undoubtedly reckless at times, laid the foundations for contemporary research. Consequently, a number of thinkers, many of whom were at the forefront of developments in transpersonal psychology, such as Maslow, Stanislav Grof, found psychedelic research to be a promising field of inquiry. Indeed, transpersonal psychology, which has its roots in thought of Aldous Huxley and the human potential movement, was always related to the ideas emerging out of the psychedelic counterculture. It is unsurprising, therefore, that Harris Friedman has discussed psychedelics are now believed to, quote, offer great potential as tools for researching elusive areas within humanistic and transpersonal psychology, as well as powerful ways to facilitate humanistic and transpersonal growth. As we'll see in Chapter 8, of particular interest of the workings of this area in the late 1960s was the psychoactive substances within shamanism. And then this leads us to the last chapter of the book. Oh my gosh. Thank you everybody for being here. Please smash that like if you guys can. Last chapter is Psychedelic Shamanism. This gets into the McKenna phase of this whole process. Psychedelic Shamanism. So let me read to you guys this last section, and then we are going to conclude today's stream. Please smash that like if you guys could. And if you guys feel called to super chat, please do so using the Streamlabs link. If you prefer using YouTube, that is fine as well. So please check that out. Psychedelic mysticism is an interesting example of the research. This is, again, last chapter, concluding comments of the chapter of psychedelic shamanism. This is now, we have the 1950s Aldous Huxley, 1960s Timothy Leary. We have a government crackdown on the use of drugs in America in 1970s, and then we have the reemergence of the psychedelic drugs as a cultural process in the name of shamanism beginning in the 1980s, most notably with scholars such as Michael Harner, as well as popular figures such as Terence McKenna. So this is where we're going to be focusing on now. Concluding comments. Psychedelic mysticism is an interesting example of the search for transcendence in societies in which the individual consciousness has, as Daniel Legger put it, freed itself, quote, from the hold of dominant codes of religious meaning and gave traditional societies their symbolic armature in the form of accepted norms and shared values, unquote. It is a conspicuous example of the, quote, subjective turn of modern culture. Hallucinogens are utilized as prosthetic technologies that extend the reach of the experiencing self along, quote, inner paths to outer space, unquote. So you see the Hermetic adage, as above, so below, as within, so without. Again, the technologies of transcendence, the use of drugs is tied still to the magical concepts, magical theology, which always tends to be monistic and, as we'll see here, turns into a paganistic valorization. Indeed, as indicated in Chapter 1, the transporting of a person to inner space, psychedelics induce experiences with a detraditionalizing bias. Whether we think of Christianity, Tantric ideas, Buddhist thought, Vedantism, spiritualism, or any other system of belief, the core concepts, when viewed through a psychedelic lens, focus on the experiencing self. Psychedelic shamanism, for example, typically includes references to ancient indigenous beliefs and techniques that are free-floating, detached from their original interpretive frameworks, and reinterpreted according to a range of their otherly subjected, determined cultural memes. This is not, however, to argue that they are any less significant because they are predominantly late modern individualized constructions. We should resist the conservative imposition of normative categories of religion and religious experience. Just as Sabina's comment to folk Catholicism did not make her any less, quote, authentic as a Mazatec shaman, so constructions of self and practice informed by psychedelic experience do not make them any less, quote, shamanic. However, that rather slippery term is understood. That, quote, endogenous knowledge, when translated and commoditized, comes to take on a fragmentary nature of society by which it is appropriated, should be expected. That there are differences between, say, even shamanism and modern Western psychedelic shamanism is evident in their distinct approaches to healing and divination. As Vladimir Bazalov notes that at the notes of the Ivan shamans, quote, as well as protecting his fellow tribesmen while they were alive, he accompanied their souls to the other world. It was also his business to diagnose the causes of disease and to treat them. He could learn from the spirits what had happened in the future and the location of lost people, animals, and things, unquote. In other words, divination and healing tend to be understood centrifugally. The focus of sacred labor is directed outward towards others in the community rather than centripetally. The focus of sacred labor is directed inward toward the self. For example, Sabina was principally understood as a community healer. Hallucinogens, and when he says Sabina, he's talking about Maria Sabina. In 1955, R. Gordon Wassen wrote an article in Time magazine or Life magazine. Life magazine. This was the first article that really brought forth psychedelic mushrooms as into the cultural psyche, and this was about him and his wife, Valentina Pavlovna's encounter with Maria Sabina, a Mazatec shamaness. And so they found this woman, they went down to Mexico, she dosed them with mushrooms, and they had these incredible experiences, and then they came back and wrote about it. Unfortunately, to Maria Sabina's disappointment, she became very popular later to the 1960s counterculture, and they used to go down to where she was, and they basically destroyed her entire village and city due to psychedelic tourism. Hallucinogens were taken, spirits were consulted, and soul flight was embarked upon as part of her ritual labor for others. Quote, the wise one, she insisted, is born to cure, unquote. Likewise, the saint children cure, unquote. Because of the self-oriented experience-seeking young people who visited her did not respect the centrifugal nature of her vocation, she felt that the, quote, saint children had been abused and as a result had abandoned her. The mushrooms ceased to work once they had been exploited by those interested only in their instrumental value as esoteric technologies and the service of the experiencing self. Although there is an emphasis on healing within contemporary psychedelic shamanism, it does tend to be detraditionalized, being primarily informed by the discourse of self-spirituality and the holistic milieu. For example, although D. Corneille notes that, quote, shamanic contexts, unquote, are healing contexts, medicinal rather than escapist, the focus is typically centripetal concerning the psychological well-being and spiritual illumination rather than the centrifugal. After about 30 minutes, Elle started to rock, chant, and repeat, I remember, unquote. She went into a healing crisis and began purging and vomiting a lot. Later, she said she journeyed back through her DNA and accessed encoded memories all the way back to the primal ocean. She was in a healing crisis for almost a whole week afterwards. She was in a healing crisis. D. Corneille continues, taking it in a group setting with people who knows and trusts facilitates a shamanic healing experience while experiencing interpersonal bonds and connections. One individual often goes into a healing crisis, and many of the rest of the group then begin shamanic work. At some point, this is resolved, and then everyone tends to enter deeper physical and mental space with each other. The resulting energetic connections seem to be part of a healing process. The fine light vibrations of the experience often last a week. I feel better physically after mushrooms strengthen rather than with the wiped out feeling, unquote. Bearing the centripetal detraditionalized perspective in the mind, the following comment by McKenna is revealing. Terence McKenna. While we can discover and even to some degree penetrate rural systems of psychedelic healing, we shall find it very hard to find people who look beyond the curing power to ask what is its basis and what is the meaning of the hallucinogen-induced visions generally. The ayahuasca takers observe the worlds in space and time in their visions, but they feel a different sort of involvement and understanding in what this may mean or in testing to validate what they may believe. At the edge of things, where the really intense DMD-caused visions occur, it is hard for the shaman's personality not to be dissolved in a more primitive reaction of fear and unthinking awe. The curing shaman will not seek experiences in such titanic landscapes, and the researching shamanic explorer must step lightly, testing epistemological equipment at every step. I am left to conclude that we must remain our own guides into those still elusive dimensions, more unexplored than we had previously imagined. This emphasis on the subjective nature of psychedelic experience, quote, the narcotic experience of the shamanic experiences are, on the one hand, on one and the same. This is how we need to understand statements such as, quote, the presence of psychoactive substance is a primary requirement for all true shamanism, unquote. The same is largely true of Castaneda. In his first two books, Robert Fuller is quite right when he argues that Castaneda's account sever Native American use of botanical substances from the tribal and ritual context that structured them and imbued them with meaning. As he says, an important purpose of Native American ceremonies is to reinforce group loyalty and rekindle commitment to tribal mores. A shaman's prestige is a direct function of his ability to use his extraordinary states of consciousness for the benefit of the group. Healing, however, is a key term within the holistic milieu. As Wade Clark Roof has commented, the body is central to healing experiences. Whatever the type of healing, all such experiences are grounded in an embodied self. That is a continuous process of development and idealization. Roof goes on to say, quote, health is an idealization of a kind of self, and healing is part of the process by which growth toward the ideal is achieved, unquote. Within psychedelic shamanism, this is often informed by romantic sacralization of nature, which explains the preference for natural psychoactives. Some users I spoke to were less keen to stress in a tone that indicated an ascetic commitment to their chosen path. that they did not use artificial psychoactives such as LSD or ketamine, but only those substances that could be forged from nature. Healing is dependent upon reconciliation with nature, what Rozak referred to as the old gnosis. Quote, the ancient and original nature philosophy of our species. You can think of Stoicism. Again, this idea of getting in line with nature through their understanding of virtue and the logos. Alex Guerin discovered a similar discourse among Australian ayahuasca drinkers. They found their medicine and now only consume ayahuasca. In some instances, ayahuasca drinkers may make distinctions between organic and inorganic chemistry, such as between ayahuasca and LSD, and hierarchize ayahuasca to levels of sanctity, power, and purity beyond synthetic or man-made chemicals. Informed by romantic currents, the relationship between nature and self is sacralized over and against the profane dislocation occasioned by the Industrial Revolution. With the above comments in mind, it is worth noting that Mary Douglas referred to as the myth of primitive piety in an article written in 1970 and illustrated with well-known countercultural images such as covers from the International Times and the Fabulous Fury Freak Brothers. Douglas observed that, quote, in the 19th century, the heathen was thought to be sunk in darkness. Now there is a widespread idea that the primitive peoples are always and have been religious. Sometimes the religious form is thought to be highly magical. Sometimes it is supposed to be ecstatic. But it seems to be an important premise of popular thinking about us, the civilized, and them, the primitives, that we are secular, skeptical, and frankly tending more and more away from religious belief, and that they are highly religious. In this criticism, Adolf van Harnack's construction of the historical Jesus, George Tyrrell's famously commented that, quote, the Christ that Harnack sees looking back through 19th centuries of Catholic darkness is only the reflection of a liberal Protestant face seen at the bottom of a deep well, unquote. I often recall this comment when I need a reminder that we tend to tailor the past to serve our needs and wants. Much psychedelic shamanism, central to which is often an account to the long trip, is conspicuously guilty of this. In articulation of the myth of primitive piety encourages devotees to look down the deep well of history to discover the epitome of the healed human, the romantic noble savage, uncorrupted by the modern world and in tune with nature and its elemental forces. The face looking back at them, of course, is none other than their own reflection, the late modern construction of the ideal human, the archetypal shamanic being. This is evident in McKenna's work. For McKenna, the shaman is able to function as a, quote, doctor of the soul, because he is the real and living exemplar of the primordial mythical human condition, and in being so maintains the reality and immediacy of the sacred. Another example of a psychedelic explorer who peered down the well of history only to gaze upon his own reflection was Anton Artaud. As we have seen, he traveled to Mexico in 1936 after reading about the revolution, the aim of which he believed was to restore early pre-Columbian civilization. He was also inspired by Henry Burgesson's vitalism to believe that peyote rituals in the Tarahumara would provide direct access to a sense of sacredness engendered by primal and natural forces, the connection with which had been severed by materialistic rationalist culture of Europe. An existential breakthrough into a state of healing and transformation would, as he conceived, occur only when the connection had reestablished during his immersion into the peyote rituals of the Tarahumara. As Uri Hertz has commented, his aim was the harnessing of shamanic forces of pre-Columbian sorcery to subvert European ideology and heal what he perceived to be a plague threatening the collective body of the psyche. Concerning the content of psychedelic experience, Artaud identified the shamanic forces of pre-Columbian sorcery as sometimes experienced as what might be called a personal other, McKenna's machine elves and Castaneda's allies. As in the history of mysticism, it would appear that this discourse of the personal other articulates certain core aspects of the psychedelic experience, particularly DMT intoxication. In other words, regardless of the idiosyncratic terms in which it is expressed, along with the monistic bias of psychedelic experience, there is a perception of the I-thou encounter. As noted in the first chapter of Rick Strassman's psychedelic research revealed at least half of his observers reported encounters with manifestations of the personal other. They use expressions like entities, beings, aliens, guides, helpers to describe them. It is still startling to see my written records and comments like, there were these beings, I was being led, unquote. Likewise, in his later work on the psychedelic experience, Metzner argued that hallucinogens induce a perception of non-material, normally invisible spirit beings and entities, which are, quote, recognized as being associated with particular animals, unquote. Certain plants, trees, or fungi, certain places, deceased ancestors, and other non-ordinary entities. From a slightly different perspective, the theologian Harvey Cox recorded the following mescaline-induced experience. Quote, what I felt was an other moving towards me with a power of affirmation beyond anything I had ever imagined could exist. I was glad and grateful. No theory that had happened to me was artificially induced or psychotic or hallucinatory can erase its mark, unquote. We have seen that Thomas de Quincy's encountered an enigmatic entity that he called the Dark Interpreter, unquote, who helped him to understand the meaning of his visions, and that Humphrey Davy spoke to his encounters with, quote, the genius and the unknown, unquote. Such experiences of the personal other raise an important and obvious ontological issue. De Quincy, for example, was aware that the interpreter was not an an exogenous being of an independent existence, but rather a mere reflex of his inner nature. Even so, there were times he seemed convinced that the entity was actually in possession of an independent will. Quote, the interpreter sometimes swerves out of my orbit and mixes a little with alien natures. I do not also know him in these cases as my own perihelion, unquote. This ambiguity is conspicuous in psychedelic culture, which many experiencers accepting the existence of entities within the imaginal realm without thereby dismissing them as hallucinations. For example, David Luke concludes that the elves of psychedelic experience, quote, are not actually outside, but then inside is the wrong term as well, unquote. For others, because they are complex, socially significant, personal agents that have an impact on the everyday lives of experiencers, quote, actions in alternative reality can affect ordinary reality, unquote. They need to be understood as having some form of independent existence. Indeed, for some, the psychedelic experience could be framed as an experience of tulpomancy, as Samuel Visivere discusses. Tulpas, a term borrowed from the Tibetan Buddhism, are imaginary companions who are said to have achieved full sentience after being conjured through thought-form meditative practices. Think about that. Entities that exist only through thought form. I think we're getting at a sort of spiritual reality here, guys. Demonic encounters, yes, I would agree. Finally, we have seen that, as Harner discusses, quote, one of the most interesting things about shamanism is that they are very democratic. All have the potential to get spiritual revelation directly from the highest possible sources. If they have the methods, it is necessary to get much secondhand information from ordinary reality teachers. The human mind, heart, and spirit are lying dormant, waiting to come alive, unquote. This makes good sense within Western high culture. With access to the right psychoactive substances, gnosis can be experienced mystical states and ordinary reality added to anyone's itinerary of places to visit. So that concludes this book, guys. This is called High Culture, Drugs, Mysticism, and the Pursuit of Transcendence in the Modern World. It is a very interesting book by Christopher Partridge. He is not Orthodox. He is not Christian, but is highly scholastic and paints a picture of technologies of transcendence moving from the early 19th century all the way, a direct line all the way into Terence McKenna and the current psychedelic culture. So that is going to conclude today's stream. I'm going to hit these super chats real quick because I got to go. Again, we got a theology class. I'll be posting that Zoom link over in my Telegram, so please join us if you would like. Follow me on Telegram. I'll share that link right now. Here is the Telegram link if you would like to join us. Also, please become a website member. First super chat comes from Victor Ziegler. Throws in super chat and says the NL will have Conjapass with test/vax for most public life by the end of the month. Oh, the New Zealanders will have a Kufid pass. This is a great thing as it forces people to choose their side. Let the righteous and the unrighteous identify themselves. Quite some pushback from restaurants already. Well, that's great, Victor. Hopefully the New Zealanders will stand up and fight back. So definitely keep New Zealand and the Australians in our prayers. I hope everything goes well there. Again, Victor says the New Zealanders have the Kufa pass with test and vax for most public life by the end of this month. This is a great thing that forces people to choose their side. Let the righteous and the unrighteous identify themselves. Quite some pushback from restaurants already. Well, thank you so much, Victor, for your support. And God bless you. God bless your family. God bless the New Zealanders and the Australians. Good buddy, Ian to the Wild. Says, God bless, brother. See you in class later. I also have some new beats to send you. Really connected with this stream. Glad to catch a live one again, finally. Well, thank you so much, Ian, for your contribution, brother. Thank you for the super chat. And we definitely will be seeing each other in class. Again, if you guys want to join, follow my Telegram. And Jack Gregory throws in another super chat and says, where does the idea that, quote, psychedelics leads to one enlightenment come from? It seems as if it's a dogma within New Age groups to view it as sacred/God sin. And how do we see an Orthodox paradigm refute this claim? Thanks. Well, I don't have a whole lot of time to dive into this, but the idea that mystical, drug-induced mysticism can lead to enlightenment does not come from the New Age. That is a very ancient practice that goes all the way to shamanism and then goes into the ancient mystery traditions. You can look at the Rig Veda. Go read the Rig Veda and how it talks about the Vedic god Soma. It's gonna use very similar rhetoric and language. It's that the phenomenological experience people have in these altered states, that is where they get the validity for them being true. And it's people believing what they experienced was true, and that has continued all the way to hashish opium use in Islam, hashish opium use in alchemy, in the Western esoteric traditions, into Blavatsky, into Crowley, into Huxley, into Leary, into McKenna. And so it's not the New Age per se. In fact, you could say the New Age is not as psychedelic per se as psychedelic spirituality, although in the 21st century, these things blend so much, it's hard to differentiate the New Age from psychedelic spirituality. But Jack Gregory, good question. In regards to an Orthodox paradigm, how to refute it, it's that we use objective categories of logic. Also, we have a presupposition for an Orthodox worldview. We begin at a totally different point, and that begins with revelation being truth, not our phenomenological experience of reality being the sole measure of truth. And so because we begin our understanding of epistemology with revelation and also things like the laws of logic, like rational understanding, like mathematics, we come to different understandings of what is true and what is not true. So thank you very much, guys. I'm going to hop off here. Again, if you want to join our theology course, we are going to be starting right now over on the Telegram channel. I'll be posting the Zoom link. So I will check you guys there as always.